Olá, boa tarde a todos. Feliz Ano Novo para todos vocês que estão acompanhando aí normalmente as lives e as intervenções do Instituto Nacional de Proteção de Dados. Eu sou Cláudio Lucena, sou diretor de Relações Internacionais do Instituto e para dar as boas-vindas para vocês que sempre acompanham as nossas discussões aqui no INPD, esse ano a gente começa com uma olhada, com uma olhada especial para uma dos desdobramentos importantes que vamos ter ao longo desse ano, seguramente, no cenário global de proteção de dados, que são os desdobramentos do projeto de lei chinês sobre proteção de dados pessoais. Eu tive a felicidade de participar ao final do ano passado. Acho que todo mundo que está olhando para a proteção de dados, de alguma forma, está sempre procurando saber também, se atualizando. Nós temos, digamos assim, golden standards, padrões assim, para onde olhar sempre, com normas como o GDPR, mas a gente olha também para outros lugares do mundo. E já havia procurando um pouquinho atualizar sobre os desdobramentos chineses, e ao final do ano, durante o IGF, em Berlim, através de um evento da Global Internet Governance Academy Network, a GigaNet, que vocês estão vendo aqui, uma instituição que vocês podem, inclusive, procurar, o site é esse, a URL, um evento de acadêmicos sobre governança de internet, e a convite de uma grande amiga, Ioanna Stupariu, fui convidado para dar uma olhada num artigo específico que tratava sobre o projeto de lei da China. Tive a oportunidade de me aprofundar um pouco nisso. E nesse momento que eu olhei, quando a gente conseguiu se reunir, eu encontrei também com uma outra colega chamada Wanshu Cong, e a Wanshu fez a apresentação desse paper que a gente estava avaliando e comentando, e aí me veio a ideia de trazê-las para aqui, junto com a gente, para uma das lives do INPD, para a gente conversar juntos sobre esse projeto chinês de proteção de dados pessoais. Então, eu agradeço muito a presença das duas aqui. Nós não vamos ter como norma, como língua de hoje, que a Wanshu e a Ioanna não falam português, e a gente vai se virar numa interpretação simultânea, tá certo? Eu queria agradecer a todos vocês por estarem voltando a nos acompanhar nas nossas lives de INPD. Vamos aqui mergulhar um pouquinho mais no universo da lei chinesa, e aí vou tentar traduzir um pouquinho, a cada intervenção delas eu traduzo um pouquinho para vocês em português. Então vamos começar dando as boas-vindas. Thank you very much, Wanshu. Thank you very much, Ioanna, for being here with us. I was telling them about how we met. Ioanna is a part of my network of friends, a very special friend who is looking at data protection and other issues in digital law with me. And then you invited me for GigaNet, and in GigaNet I got in touch with Wanshu's work, and I thought that this could be an interesting starting point for our year in the National Institute for Data Protection. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope we have a very fruitful conversation. Wanshu, would you mind introducing yourselves to our audience and how you got in what do you do at the moment? What are your interests, your projects, and how you got into data protection? Thank you very much.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Claudio, for inviting me. I'm very delighted to be here and discuss the draft law with you. Currently, I'm a postdoc fellow at the European University Institutes, and my current research looks at discourses on cyber sovereignty by different states, non-state, sub-state, and transnational actors. I'm particularly interested in the perspective from the global south. Before joining the EUI, I did my PhD at McGill. My background is in international law and human rights, and so during my PhD, I worked on the human rights issues related to digital surveillance by public and private actors. So basically, this is how I got into data protection.
Thank you very much. Ioanna, desculpem, gente, a Wanshu é hoje uma pesquisadora pós-doutoral no Instituto Max Planck, também ligada à Universidade do Instituto Europeu de Florença. Trabalhou no doutoramento dela com questões de direitos humanos, direitos digitais, e essa pesquisa que ela desenvolve atualmente na entidade onde ela está atualmente afiliada é uma pesquisa especificamente que tem a ver com cibersoberania. E aí, acho que a geopolítica de proteção de dados é uma coisa que é muito clara para todo mundo. Todo mundo entende que os aspectos de proteção de dados hoje vão muito além. Acho que isso é uma coisa também que está muito em voga no Brasil, muito além da proteção de dados propriamente dita. Nós envolvemos economia, política, geopolítica e relações internacionais, que é parte do background dela, né? Então é assim que ela chegou na proteção de dados pessoais. Ioanna, a pleasure to have you on board, my friend. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good night, good evening.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Claudio, for the invitation. Nice to meet everyone, and nice to be here to discuss this, I think, very important topic. A bit about myself. For the past 6 years, I've been researching data regulation at the Central European University in Budapest and in Vienna. That was basically way before the GDPR, the famous data protection framework, which the Europeans have put in place. Currently, I'm affiliated with another university, a Romanian one, where I'm an associate professor on EU law. And I'm also running a small consultancy firm under the umbrella of which I'm basically working with small and medium-sized companies across Europe, helping them implement privacy standards into their operations as a data protection officer or as an external consultant. This is also why I'm here, to also bring part of the practical experience that I managed to gather in the last few years, working with the companies firsthand to implement GDPR and privacy standards overall.
Thanks a lot, Ioanna. If your projects or one of your projects currently concern small and medium enterprises, you are of particular interest for the follow-up of our work in the institute. We're just starting the implementation of our LGPD, which is the acronym for the Brazilian law. And small and medium enterprises are always, I think, everywhere in the world. Small and medium enterprises are always an issue. If we look at big players at the big platforms, they always have a team, resources, a way, a roadmap. They always have something to start from. Small and medium enterprises are core to the work, because without them we have no environment, and it's usually a bit more difficult to them. So I believe we're not finishing this presentation here today. A Ioanna passa para vocês, gente, que a formação dela é junto à Universidade de Budapeste, a Central European University, né? É lá que ela faz, está ligada no doutoramento. Hoje também é professora assistente em Budapeste, na Romênia, numa universidade na Romênia, e além disso também tem uma consultoria. A Ioanna, eu sei que já atua como DPO há algum tempo, que nós estamos em contato, acho que pelo menos desde 2017, e ela desde aí já desempenhava atividades de DPO, né, na Europa, e hoje particularmente se dedicando às dificuldades que eu dizia a elas, que é uma dificuldade nossa também do Brasil, pequenas e médias empresas. Acho que essas pequenas e médias empresas são sempre uma componente muito importante, né? Onde a gente estiver no mundo. Eu acho que a Ioanna vai estar de volta aqui com a gente. Acho que já temos, olha, um bocado de gente aqui dando nossa boa tarde, o Cristiano, a Stephanie lá no Rio Grande do Sul, Arthur, boa tarde, Arthur, Tatiana, Rafael, meu colega, Rafael is a fellow director at INPD also, Kissila, Roberto, boa tarde, muito boa tarde, gente. Let's start from the really from the beginning. Oops, that's what happens when you go live. We're looking, Ioanna and Wanshu, usually when we look at data protection, we look at different components in a new regulatory framework, right? So there's the economic drive. There surely is a competition law drive behind the GDPR, and this is something interesting to talk about, mainly in an international perspective, international guests like you. In Brazil, there is an alignment also. We were outside this discussion up until now, at least from a systematic point of view. Now we're trying to fit in as we fight to promote digital transformation in Brazil. So there are drivers behind any law specifically, and particularly behind data protection in specific. What would you say the drivers behind the Chinese data protection law be, Wanshu, if you could start? I think
I think we...
Okay,
all right.
Can you hear me now? Good.
Yep, perfect, loud and clear.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of the drivers, okay, when the National People's Congress, so actually the Law Committee of the National People's Congress released this bill for gathering public comments in October, it also published a kind of a preface in company with this bill to explain their decisions, intentions, approaches, and methodology when drafting this bill. So in there, the preface mentions 3 points about the necessity of having a special law on personal information protection. I'm not sure if that preface got translated into English or Portuguese at all. So I'll just take the opportunity to relay what the Law Committee mentioned in the preface, and I'll also add on some of my observations. So the first point is related to the policy and legislative moves up till now. So personal information protection has been inserted in various laws, decisions, regulations. So at the level of law, so we have China's cybersecurity law, e-commerce law, the revised consumer protection law, and the Chinese criminal law has revised article on crimes that are related to the violation of personal information. And most recently, the Chinese Civil Code, which was adopted on May 28th last year, includes provisions on privacy and personal information protection. And the current bill is sort of based on or built on all these recent legislative moves and provides a more specific legal framework that is more targeted and practical for the purpose of protecting personal information. In this respect, we could also pay attention to another bill which is currently under deliberation. It's the bill on data security released in late June 2020. So under that bill, the stake of data security is brought to the level of state or national security, and it actually covers all types of data. And so the issue or the bill of personal information protection will be kind of like a lex specialis of that data security law. So overall, there has been quite a significant proliferation of regulatory initiatives on issues related to personal information protection over the recent years at different levels. Here, I'd like to just share my screen with you because I've made just 2 PowerPoints to give you a sort of visual sense of the state of current.
That would be great, Wanshu. Would you mind if I transpose to the Portuguese and to this part that you have made now?
Sure.
Thank you very much. A Wanshu vai compartilhar com a gente alguns slides, gente. Catilu Montesinos, olha aqui, Catilu foi aluna nossa aqui na UEPB há alguns anos, né? Catilu deve estar falando com a gente do Peru, exatamente. Good afternoon, Catilu. Good afternoon also, Rafaela, everybody following here us. Wanshu vai compartilhar aqui uns slides, gente, a pergunta era sobre o que está por trás. A gente fala sobre aspectos econômicos, aspectos geopolíticos, aspectos jurídicos especificamente, e a pergunta para começar para a Wanshu era o que ela acha que está por trás, qual é o driver, né? Qual é a motivação por trás da lei chinesa de proteção de dados. E ela desenha para a gente um cenário que é o Comitê Jurídico, né, do Comitê Nacional do Partido Popular se reúne e diz que a Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados, que havia uma necessidade de ter uma lei sobre proteção de informação pessoal, protection of personal information. E essa lei vem junto, é o que a Wanshu coloca para a gente, essa lei vem junto com outras normas jurídicas também discutidas nesse momento na China, que anotei rapidinho, depois eu pergunto de novo: cybersecurity, e-commerce, criminalidade eletrônica, e um outro movimento também do governo chinês em equiparar segurança de dados hierarquicamente à segurança nacional, certo? Esse é o movimento em que a gente foi deixado aqui pela Wanshu, e agora you have the floor, Wanshu, back. Let's go through.
I'd just like to give you a sort of visual sense about the current state of the regulatory initiatives.
We were looking at the screen. Now we just have a black screen here. Once you maximize, we did not see it anymore. Yeah, that's it. I think you can follow from there.
Okay, then no animation whatsoever, but this gonna be okay, I guess. So if
that should be.
I'll try to make it as big as possible. So, well, this is the chart will not be complete, but we can briefly just look at these 4 categories of regulatory instruments. So at the top level, we have laws and decisions made by the National People's Congress, and there we have, the new laws, and the laws got amended in the recent years that had addressed issues on personal information protection. And here we have basically administrative rules, and I just listed what I could find, but they all somehow address issues on personal data protection. And that's the judicial interpretation of Supreme People's Court and Supreme People's Procuratorate, and of course the sort of bindingness and the level of the bindingness of their decision. There have been tons of controversies among Chinese academics, but we don't have to spend our time on that. And here that's the national or industrial standards. And just in this category, I need a separate slide because there are so many of them. And the different colors, just to give you a sense that they're at different stages. Some are currently effective, some are just under deliberation or in the state of draft, and then they're gathering public comments, some are under preparation. So yeah, just these 2 slides basically to give you a visual sense of the situation. Can I maybe stop sharing, or if you want to?
Yep, I can remove it from here. Thank you very much. I think it gives gives us a good overview, Wanshu.
Right, sorry, and the list is incomplete, and especially for the standards, it's not complete, and there are still more and more going on. So.
A Wanshu mapeou aqui para vocês interpretações judiciais, standards ou padrões, né, de interpretação de indústria nacionais, regulações administrativas e projetos de lei. Eu acho que depois a gente consegue disponibilizar esse slide, vai ficar disponível tanto aqui na live como depois no portal do INPD, para a gente separar com você. Mas a Ioanna, gente, a Ioanna também ela atua na União Europeia, está baseada na União Europeia, mas também pelo projeto de pesquisa dela e pelo trabalho, também está de olho nos desdobramentos chineses, né? Então, ela tem algumas visões para a gente. Ioanna, I was telling our audience that you're also connected and following closely the developments in Chinese data protection law, and that you could have complementary or even an alternative view on that driver behind, or on those drivers behind the Chinese bill of law. What would you have to enlighten us?
That's correct, Claudio. Thank you, and thank you, Wanshu, for the regulatory overview. It's very interesting to see how all the elements of the legislation in China are now sort of completing each other, and they led to this point to actually have a data protection law. What many people may not know is that this is the first time ever that China will have a dedicated data protection law. So far, all privacy-related provisions have been scattered in different sectoral legislation, as Wanshu has explained. And it's very interesting to see why we have now a draft law on data protection, and how this is connected to the GDPR or to the Brazilian data protection law or to what has happened in the US in the last years. And I just want to make a general comment that this is very, from my understanding, this is very much connected to the geopolitical development and to economic drivers, because China is trying to keep up with the European Union and the US in being the key drivers of regulation in technology overall at the global level. And this is explained not only with regards to privacy, it's also explained with regards to general security. Look at, for instance, the debate on 5G. This is another interesting topic about, how 5G and security reasons have led to different interesting decisions which are shaping laws in both US, EU, and China. But particularly with regards to China, I think it's very interesting that they have recently just made this very strong statement saying that they want to have a framework for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity and privacy as part of cybersecurity overall, right, is one of the priorities for the Chinese government in the year to come. And actually, it's not only, as Wanshu has explained, it's not only this data protection law, which is on the table, on the verge of being adopted in China, it's also this draft data security law. And these two laws are basically priorities for the Chinese government because they want to make their companies competitive on the global market as well, because they don't want to miss out on the debate on how privacy rights and on how security overall are being shaped in the overall global world, because we are no longer talking about closed markets, right? Chinese companies are present in the US, in Europe, in Brazil, and also these other companies, Brazilian, Argentinian, American, African, like we are now living in a globalized world. China knows this, and that's why I think they took this very strong stance and they decided to actually make a step further and do regulate privacy and data protection, because of course there's differences between them. So that's my feeling, and that's what I think has been driving this strong position towards regulation of data protection rights.
Interesting. Wanshu, you also have a take on that, right? And I think it's also time to start putting the hard questions on the table. My fellow Rafael, who is also a fellow director at the Institute, is already throwing us a couple of questions that are absolutely natural when we talk about this scenario everywhere, and particularly maybe even because of the lack of enough references that we have from Chinese scholars, because we are not very familiar. The language is not very, let's say, transparent or friendly to us. These connections here that we have, as we have with Wanshu and Ioanna today, who are looking deeply at the theme, are not very frequent. So I think those are doubts that usually come up. Wanshu, you would like to have a take on that?
Sure. I would say I agree with what Ioanna said, and just give you one more piece of information regarding the sort of the political willingness behind behind China when coming up with all these sort of regulatory initiatives. So on January 10th, about 10 days ago, the state government issued a plan on building the rule of law in China for 2020 to 2025, which includes the strengthening legislation in key fields, emerging fields, and foreign-related fields, strengthening legislation in the field of information technology, and follow up on and study relevant legal schemes on issues such as digital economy, internet finance, artificial intelligence, big data, and cloud computing. So we can actually predict the steady increase of regulatory initiatives in the digital sector. Meanwhile, regarding Ioanna's point about the geopolitical circumstances, I totally agree, and I think it would be a mistake to only look at domestic drivers, but we have to look at the global environment, and then we can see how sort of the external factor got converged with domestic drivers. In this respect, just one more point. So it's actually very interesting if you look at the bill. Well, I don't know what kind of text you got in hand. The bill actually contains provisions about, what's it called? Countermeasures against discriminatory measures of foreign legislation. Mm-hmm. And in relation to this, there is recently a document issued by the Ministry of Commerce called Rules on Blocking Unjustified Extraterritorial Application of Foreign Legislation and Other Measures. So we can have a sense of how, the Chinese government or legislature are trying to manage extraterritorial rules to alleviate difficulties that Chinese business face when they operate overseas. Meanwhile, I think we can also pay attention to China's participation in major regional and those major regional trade and investment agreements, because that would also push domestic lawmaking processes in the digital sector as well. So, for example, the recent agreement called RCEP, so Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership with ASEAN countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So it contains a chapter on e-commerce, then which naturally deals with cross-border data flow. China is also considering joining the TPP, which has even stricter rules regarding cross-border data flow. And just by the end of last year, China had this preliminary deal with the EU, and well, we need to see the details about how they're going to do with that. But I think in brief, all these external factors, from extraterritorial application of foreign legislation to this mega trade investment agreements, that would definitely bring extra motivations as well as concerns for the domestic legislators to consider.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you mind if I just try to transpose a bit of that, because that was a lot for our audience. I know many.
That's why I'm not intervening. I'm letting you translate, and then we go back to the discussion.
True. Many people in our audience are absolutely following, but then we have the other Portuguese fellows who are following here, and that was a lot. Gente, para voltar à intervenção anterior, né, da Ioanna, a Ioanna fazia essa observação de quais eram os drivers desse movimento chinês do ponto de vista dela na Europa, e é bastante interessante, e para ela é muito claro que esse esforço chinês é um esforço de inclusão no mercado global, de competitividade. E aqui vocês veem uma coisa, talvez um paralelo interessante entre o que nós estamos vivendo agora no Brasil e o que com um pouquinho de atraso também está acontecendo esse ano na China. A Ioanna lembra que é a primeira vez que a China tem uma norma sistemática, um quadro completo de proteção de dados pessoais. Isso não lembra muito a nossa situação. Nós tínhamos setores fortemente regulados, passamos a ter agora uma norma sistemática de proteção de dados. É um quadro muito semelhante em relação à China. Ela também vê outros desdobramentos acontecendo, né? Desdobramentos geopolíticos também, empresas, companhias chinesas precisam se posicionar melhor no mercado global, em que dados pessoais e o formato digital, de uma forma geral, tem uma importância muito grande, e sem essa discussão e sem esse esforço, né, dificilmente a China se insere do mesmo jeito, ou então encontra dificuldades que não encontrará se eles fizerem o dever de casa. E aí o Wanshu completa mostrando que o desdobramento, a Wanshu inclusive dá detalhes dessas normas. Eu estou perdendo aqui porque eu estou tentando traduzir os tópicos para vocês, mas a Wanshu deu detalhes de vigor dessas normas, né? Falou março do ano passado, depois, e agora mais uma norma de janeiro, e as duas trazem de volta um aspecto que eu acho que é interessante para a gente, que o governo chinês considera relevante o aspecto digital de uma forma geral. A gente está vendo, né, a importância que o governo chinês dá ao desdobramento digital, mas com uma diferença marcada aí entre proteção de dados pessoais e proteção de data security, né? Segurança de dados separada, inclusive equiparando em alguns momentos essa segurança de dados a questões de segurança nacional, olhando para a cibersegurança mesmo com muito mais atenção. So, Ioanna, there was something from the last point that Wanshu made that you were going to pick up.
Yeah, I just wanted to actually mention a recent development that, you know, that the EU, as Wanshu said, is being negotiating an investment treaty, an investment deal with China. And actually just the last days, China tried to add a clause that would basically allow it to sanction European companies not respecting its own data transfer rules. So again, the way in which these cases happen abroad influence the politics of the Chinese government, and of course the way in which they regulate their own matters at home. So this is just one of the reasons why I think it's not just about China, it's about China and the world, and what happens outside very much influences what happens in China. Yes, I think we lost Claudio, but regardless, maybe Claudio is just surprised by what we said. Maybe we can answer the question, because there's been a very interesting question in meanwhile from the audience of Mr. Rafael Reis. And actually, I
want those state surveillance, huh?
Yeah. Yes, we just discovered the comment section. Keep asking questions if you have questions. I just wanted to try to give an answer to that because it's very interesting that China has always had this, not very pro-privacy approach as a state, or that's at least how it's been known outside, abroad. That it's I'm going to quote from your comment, state of surveillance, and that may be true, especially given some of the recent provisions like the social credit system or the contact tracing apps. And I think Wanshu can talk more about the health app. But I think if you look at this particular law, you're going to notice that there's a lot of the majority of the law is very similar to the GDPR and to the Brazilian data protection law. So if you look at the law, you're going to see that you also have a data protection officer's requirements. You also have obligations, the same individual rights that are, or more or less the same that are mentioned in the GDPR and in the Brazilian data protection law. The same basis for data collection, data processing. A lot of the provisions are similar, but still there's also some differences. It's normal because they try to make it their own, to align it with the rest of the legislation. And I just want to underline a very interesting provision. This caught my eye. The fact that there's a disclosure of data to overseas enforcement and judicial bodies, which requires prior approval of the Chinese authorities. That's something that we don't have in other countries, and that's something that I think is very much telling for still what's happening in China and this rather ownership of privacy or of data that the Chinese government has, or this different vision than we have in Europe. We don't have this approach here, at least. And
also from the perspective of domestic consistency of legislation, you have to address the issue that's raised in the cybersecurity law about basically the default rule was pretty much data localization. So, okay, indeed, there is a specific law about personal information protection, and it does give some mechanism for also cross-border transfer of personal information, but you have to sort of bridge also with cybersecurity law. And if you look at also the relationship between this law, to a certain extent, you can say personal information protection law is kind of a lex specialis or cybersecurity law, or is actually a component of that to help states or organizations to actually implement better the cybersecurity law. So yeah, that's the way you see. I would say you can only understand that from the perspective of ensuring the consistency of domestic law, despite different, say raison d'être behind them.
Welcome back.
Thanks again. Thanks for following, and I see you've taken on the next point that we were discussing, right? Well, what is it that we should be looking at specifically in the new framework? Essa era a próxima pergunta, gente, que a gente tinha. Me desculpem aí. Obrigado, Roberto, e Alessandra pelo apoio. A gente está seguindo aqui, tem uns problemas de conexão, mas a gente segue. E o que a gente tinha levantado era exatamente o que as duas viam como diferenças em termos de estrutura. E a Ioanna lembra muito do que há, e acho que isso é uma coisa que acontece com todos os frameworks globais de proteção de dados. Gente. Há aspectos que não há como a gente fugir, né? A Ioanna lembra a definição, os conceitos, a existência de um DPO, de um encarregado, está tudo lá. Né, estão refletidos, mas que há algumas coisas específicas na norma chinesa e ela pinça exatamente o fato de como você processa informações, de como você faz disclosure, né, exibição dessas informações a autoridades públicas, que há necessidade da intervenção específica do governo chinês, e a Wanshu lembra que não é simplesmente a existência dessa obrigação, mas a compatibilização dessa obrigação com outras normas chinesas que provavelmente exigem o mesmo mecanismo, né? Essas mesmas providências. A gente já tem algumas outras perguntas. We have a couple of other questions here, but I think maybe you should explore this. Is there any other difference or particularity that you would draw from the bill that is not actually present, or that is significantly different from the other provisions and other global frameworks we have?
The one that got my attention, I sort of covered it already. That's, the countermeasure provision, which I thought was very interesting because I don't remember seeing that. Well, certainly not in the GDPR, but I haven't seen that in, I think, LGDP either. It's, a signal of, the response that, say, China would take if the extraterritorial application of foreign data protection law is considered as unjustified. I thought that's a very interesting sign. And but immediately related to that, the law also the bill also commits the state to participating in international cooperation and the lawmaking process. So, and I don't really remember seeing, well, maybe there is, but it's not in my memory that any other legislation would have that kind of commitment.
Not that I can remember either.
So I thought these two are actually interesting. And if you also see that from a geopolitical perspective.
And I also think from the perspective of human rights, think just about the impact that the adoption of GDPR had. So just think that you're in Europe and you've been having the EU Data Protection Directive for several years now in the EU. So basically all European states and European citizens were aware more or less of privacy and data protection, and still the adoption of the GDPR in 2016 and then entering into force in 2018 was a paramount moment, right? It was a huge statement. It was the key piece of legislation, probably of that decade. It influenced everything from business to human rights to how a state started to renegotiate some treaties, to investments, everything. In China, just as Wanshu said, it's just a lex specialis. So the priority is not to make privacy paramount for citizens and for the state, right? The priority here is to align the state to the standards globally. So that's why I think it's cybersecurity and data security that take the forefront, and personal information protection are just lex specialis, so they are just on the side. And that's how maybe they managed to solve this paradox, this apparent conflict between China being a state of surveillance and also China being a state that adopts personal information protection law. That's how I would see it from the outside, and that's how I think they at least are trying to solve this discrepancy. I'm very curious what's going to happen. Sorry, Claudia, I'm going to let you translate in a minute. I'm very curious to what's going to happen in practice with regards to enforcement. How they're going to create agencies, data protection authorities, whether there will be a system similar to Europe and to Brazil. And most and foremost, I'm very curious of the public reaction, whether they will actually start to think about their privacy rights, right? Because that had happened in Europe, even in the US after the GDPR and in Brazil. And whether they will start to make complaints when they realize their privacy rights, or basically this special law will not be effective. That's my question. I'm very curious. I think we lost Claudia again. Yeah, sorry, Wanshu. Maybe you can tell me a bit more.
Well, if I may, maybe I'll just just respond to some of the points that you mentioned. So yeah, the issue about state surveillance also raised earlier by the audience. I actually find it was surprising to me that in the bill it contained actually a section on so-called specific provisions on state organs handling personal information. And it was striking to me because I had this presumption, to a certain extent it's probably justified. I had the presumption that the bill is going to just address issues with basically private companies mostly, or entities dealing with personal information rather than state organs. Because, this sort of bifurcation between private surveillance versus state surveillance. But so I saw that section and got my attention, but we know it's still a bill. So during the process of deliberation, what would happen to that section, nobody knows yet. And in terms of what's included in that section, the sort of obligations and responsibilities of state organs dealing with personal information, I would say it doesn't really change the fundamental presumption about that bifurcation. Basically, it asks state authorities to stick to their scope and the scope and the mandate, but we know who's going to interpret what is the scope and mandate of state organs. So it's pretty much a self-referring kind of processes. So I wouldn't say that this specific section actually does anything to this current state of state surveillance.
I think with that, sorry. But just to make again another brief translation to our audience and to our public.
Sure.
Wanshu e Ioanna fizeram agora uma discussão interessante, gente, sobre os aspectos e o alcance. Não é? A Ioanna preocupada especificamente com os desdobramentos, e ela diz que o GDPR na Europa é uma norma, a discussão da gente aqui no Brasil mostra e reflete muito isso, é uma norma que vai muito além de transformação digital e muito além, né, de proteção de dados propriamente dita. É uma norma que acaba influenciando outros aspectos jurídicos na União Europeia. Direitos humanos, por exemplo, é um aspecto central, né, e já temos algumas interpretações interessantes em termos de direitos humanos, né, na União Europeia, derivadas de aspectos de proteção de dados, particularmente GDPR. E ela é curiosa, inclusive, em relação à reação do público, né? Como seria a reação do público chinês em termos de correr atrás de enforcement, né? De entender essa necessidade presente no dia a dia. E isso, de qualquer forma, a visão do cidadão em relação à proteção de dados pessoais tem muito a ver sobre o ritmo e o desenvolvimento do quadro de proteção de dados dentro de um país. Essa era uma discussão interessante. I think with that, we go for Rafael's question in the beginning, and also Stephanie's now, which is a development that has to do with that aspect of human right development from data protection. And also, Wanshu, if you guys don't think there is any other element that we should highlight from the Chinese data protection, we also got two other questions here. A statement from Arthur Bernard: GDPR and LGPD apply to all companies and government structures. This regulation includes the government or only for private companies? That would be an interesting clarification. And our president, Eduardo Magrani, the president of the Institute, straight from Munich in Berlin, congratulating us for the debate, and also posing a question about the expectation concerning international transfers with the EU adequacy decision. Where would you guys like to start or to go next?
I think Wanshu has already answered the question of Mr. Bernardes, while you did not have internet connection. We tried to cover them as much as we could. But maybe if you could take the other question that's very interesting about ethnic and religious minorities in China.
Okay. Stephanie Pats.
Abraço, Mr.
For this, well, so far I don't think there is much about it. So the current bill does include the definition of sensitive data. Then the ethnicity would be actually considered as sensitive personal information. But if there is a special kind of framework for data protection for ethnic or religious minorities, I don't think there's, well, to my knowledge, I don't think there's much about it.
Em relação a grupos de proteção para grupos étnicos, religiosos, minorias, né, da Stephanie, que é a pergunta da Stephanie, a Wanshu diz que há uma definição sobre dados sensíveis, né, no draft chinês. Nós temos, inclusive, pessoal, esse draft da norma chinesa, a Wanshu enviou para a gente no INPD, a gente também disponibiliza para vocês depois da live, tá certo? A seção sobre dados sensíveis está lá e a definição de dados sensíveis é suficiente para incluir minorias étnicas e religiosas. Sobre o procedimento de tratamento específico, ela não tem até esse momento nenhuma ideia, né, mais concreta, porque, lembrem, a gente está tratando aqui de desdobramentos de um projeto de lei, né, chinês. Ainda vai a votação, ainda vai a discussão. O que a gente tem aqui é uma transposição interessante em relação aos dados sensíveis em GDPR, em LGPD. A categoria existe, mas ainda não, Stephanie, especificamente o desdobramento, de como é que a gente trata esses dados sensíveis. Anything to add about that, Ioanna, about the special? You don't have a sensitive, you don't call it sensitive, it's special. You have special categories of data, is that?
Yes, there are special categories of data, sensitive ones. There are basically biometric data, genetic data, data about sexual preferences, sexual orientation, medical data in general. These are the so-called sensitive data. I think it's the same in the Chinese draft law.
Yeah, that's correct.
All right, yeah. So maybe we can come back for Magrani's question here about the expectations that you have about the draft concerning international transfers in EU adequacy decision.
That's a very interesting topic. I'm just going to start with that because it's something that I was actually thinking a couple of days ago. Because, international data transfer within the EU is one of the hot topics within the EU. After last year, you may know or not, there was a European Court of Justice decision, Schrems II decision, in which they basically invalidated the basis for legal transfers with the US. Which means that basically the standards for data transfers are not the ones that were previously considered as acceptable. And from my perspective, any decision, any such adequacy decision or privacy shield, right, something that would give a legal basis for generalized data transfer overseas is put under a question mark, and they have not yet solved that. The only legal solution that we have now is the standard contractual clauses on a case-by-case basis. Each company has to make sure that the data transfers that they realize comply with the GDPR standards, right? So they have to check their suppliers or vendors. They have to make sure when they sign their contract that they also respect GDPR standards. Of course, now if we have a Chinese law which would be similar to the GDPR in terms of standards, it will be much easier first to have such a standard contractual clauses in place, right? Actually have such clauses, not just on paper, and then maybe even to sign a deal, right? To sign a treaty or have such an adequacy decision again. But of course, we have to see that there's also lots of politics involved. There's lots of negotiations at multiple levels. As I said, because of these discussions on investment treaties between the EU and China. So it may be one of the components to be negotiated. China is a different situation than the US, that's for sure, especially now that we do have some sort of centralized data protection law, something that the US does not have and does not plan to have. So I think it's a different discussion. So yeah, I'm optimistic, but just, of course, it's still a big question mark, even if we do adopt such a decision.
A pergunta era do Eduardo, gente. A pergunta era do Eduardo Magrani, nosso presidente Eduardo Magrani. Um abraço, Eduardo. Obrigado aí pela audiência e pelo apoio e suporte aqui de sempre. Todo mundo de INPD também ligado aqui, a Vivi Maldonado também certamente aí ligada, acompanhando a gente. A pergunta do Eduardo era qual era a expectativa em relação à decisão de adequação para transferências internacionais desse projeto da China, do cenário chinês e a União Europeia. E a Ioanna lembra para a gente que a decisão do Schrems II, que basicamente indica ou determina que o sistema de transferência internacional de dados que existia entre União Europeia e Estados Unidos, ele está questionado. Aquelas regras previamente estabelecidas não funcionam mais e que tudo está sendo feito agora em uma decisão caso a caso, através de Standard Contractual Clauses, que é uma coisa que vocês devem aí estar acompanhando. A negociação dessas Standard Contractual Clauses com a China, em função desse tratado, é uma expectativa para a qual ela tem otimismo, embora lembre que não é uma discussão meramente jurídica, simplesmente jurídica. Aqui a possibilidade desde o estabelecimento de um tratado, a continuação, né, dessa análise que caso a caso, né, on a case by case basis, mas ela disse que, havendo o sistema regulatório funcionando na China, fica evidentemente mais fácil de ter ou isso definido em um tratado, uma decisão de adequação genérica, ou uma decisão mais clara, objetiva, mesmo que seja caso a caso. Wanshu, any insights about this adequacy decision or perspectives?
Perspective. Well, given the current geopolitical circumstances, I'm a bit more sort of conservative. Let's say, for sure, there's going to be one of the key issues that's going to be covered by the negotiation with the EU in terms of the investment treaties. But I do think also the current human rights situations in China would be one of also the main considerations for the EU when they decide if they're going to give an adequacy decision for China. And this is related to the previous question regarding ethnic and religious minorities. Mm-hmm. And I think lacking a particular strong safeguards, say human rights safeguards in this respect, I would consider it as a main constraining factor.
And audio again. Yeah, it's very interesting. And now that you raised this human rights point, and that's very interesting indeed. And I'm actually thinking about China's reaction to the fact that, for instance, Sweden has refused access to its companies like to Huawei, for instance, to participate in 5G auctions. And now they're actually trying to use this to persuade the Swedish government to change its mind and to allow Huawei, by saying that if you don't allow Huawei, basically our companies, to operate into your country, we are going to make it very difficult for your companies through the legislation that we are implementing nowadays.
Yeah.
Because there's so many European and international companies operating in China, and now the standards are not as high as in the rest of the world. Uniformizing them or putting them at the same level, of course, it will make it costlier for international companies as well. So it's very interesting debate always. Where do you strike the line between the human rights sides of the arguments, right? The human rights concerns, or the economic, monetary concerns that actors have. So, very interesting.
And the sovereignty concerns also, which is in the insights that interest Wanshu a lot. Yes, definitely. Wanshu, I was curious about, we didn't have it in the roadmap we discussed, but what is the perspective for the development this year? Should we expect an approved and passed law along the year, or is it like wishful thinking?
I wouldn't say a year. That I was. Well, honestly, your guess is as good as mine. I don't have that much of information, and I know it's currently still under consideration, deliberation, and so I guess maybe 1 year would be a little bit pressed for the legislators, but again, this is really the top item in their legislative agenda. So maybe, say, if not 1 year, but we can expect it
close to that.
Yeah, maybe.
A minha pergunta aqui era uma dúvida mais operacional, gente. Se a gente deveria esperar ao longo desse ano, né, a aprovação desse projeto de lei. E a Wanshu disse que não tem condição, a nossa opinião aqui, o nosso palpite é igual ao dela, tem a mesma a precisão do dela, mas que dada a prioridade que o governo chinês dá ao caso, que a gente pode sim esperar, se não nesse ano, mas muito próximo, o desdobramento aí já teremos aí norma cogente, né, quadro regulatório definido na China. My dear colleagues, thank you very much for being with us along this hour. I really apologize for the ups and downs here of my internet connection, but I'm absolutely sure you held it strong and kept it up running. Would you still have some final remarks, any final elements that you think we should highlight or we should look at or follow as a development of these issues in China? Let's say let's start Wanshu.
Depend on the audience. Well, suppose the audience, the majority of you would be, say, students doing research, or maybe lawyers working in firms. I guess, yeah, it's definitely going to be a very thriving field that's going to see a lot of updates, changes, progresses, and it can be very difficult to keep track on everything. And so don't be put down by that. It's pretty, it's pretty reasonable. Yeah, I guess just it's going to be, we will need a lot of conversations like this as the legislative initiatives keep coming. And I look forward to future discussions with you guys.
Thank you very much, Wanshu. A pleasure. Ioanna.
Yeah, same here. I think it's been a great discussion, and I think we should have more discussions like this, especially as the law progresses, as changes may occur to the current version of the law. I think I'm very curious to see what will happen after it enters into force, because, you know, in the first year of the GDPR, for instance, there hasn't been any, or there very little to no fines, right, in many countries. And in the second year, there's been lots of fines. So it actually started to have a visible effect. Just think about the number that in 2020, in the EU, there were 272 million euros in fines overall, right? With the highest fine being 50 million euros in France for Google. And I'm very curious to see whether this will happen in China as well, because the fines are comparable, and in how much it will take to get there, to actually have strong fines to local or international companies that do not respect the standards of this new law. That's my only curiosity to see, because I think a law is only effective if it's respected and properly enforced. So,
of course, true. As expectativas, gente, que elas nos deixam, né? A Wanshu ainda esperando mais os desdobramentos e entendendo que a gente vai precisar realmente de uma construção sistemática, né, na China. E a Ioanna lembrando para a gente que até 2020 as multas de GDPR não foram muito significativas e existiram realmente de forma residual. Em 2020, ela nos traz aqui um número de... A gente, inclusive, circulou aqui no Brasil, alguém circulou nos últimos dias no Brasil, esse quantitativo de multas. E a Ioanna atualiza aí para a gente como sendo um pouco mais de 270 milhões de euros, com 50 e poucos milhões de euros sendo a mais alta na França para o Google, né? E ela lembra que esse aspecto, embora não seja aí o definidor, mas enforcement, né? E dá muito a ideia do grau de respeito que se tem internamente a uma norma jurídica. Então, eu queria agradecer a todos vocês, de novo aí pela audiência, pedir desculpas aí pelos meus problemas de conexão desse meu retorno, mas a Ioanna e a Wanshu conseguiram deixar. Espero que tenha sido interessante para vocês a discussão, e a gente está preparando aí já as nossas próximas intervenções, né, e as nossas próximas lives aqui no INPD. Muitíssimo obrigado a todos vocês, muitíssimo obrigado à audiência. Thank you very much once again, Ioanna. Thank you very much, Wanshu, for your time, here we have everybody also taking their time and to show their appreciation. Thank you very much. Gente, voltamos. Thank you. Voltamos na próxima com o INPD. Um abraço. Tchau, tchau.